my colleague Akash Kapoor, who is a senior fellow at New America and at New York University's GovLab, and he is also a visiting research scholar at Princeton University. So, without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Akash.
Thanks. Are we waiting for Pablo? Gordon? We wait for Pablo?
Yeah, let me see if I can.
Yeah, he'll be here. I can actually start just kind of with a little bit of background on how I'm seeing the title of the talk, which is not up there. But so the title of the talk, as Gordon mentioned, is Beyond Digital Empires, AI Implementation for Middle Powers or Middle Countries. So I was thinking about how to structure the talk. And I think that there's basically two strands in there. The Beyond Digital Empires signifies a kind of big picture geopolitics, questions about sovereignty, questions about agency. Oh, hey, we have one more panelist. People are trickling in. You guys all saw what it's like at the entrance. So thank you you came straight from the airport. Okay. Do you want to introduce Natalie real quick?
Yes, our final panelist, straight from the airport. Natalie, thank you for making it, rushing in. This is Natalie Black. She is Group Director for Infrastructure and Connectivity and an Executive Board member of Ofcom, which is the UK's communications industry regulator. And that includes leading Ofcom's work on the implications of artificial intelligence. Is that all correct? Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So I was saying there's these two strands. There's the kind of big picture geopolitics strand in the first part of the title of this talk, Beyond Digital Empires. And then after the colon, we have AI implementation, which signifies something very different. It's much more granular. It's much more nitty gritty. It's much more on the ground. And I think part of what we are trying to figure out in this talk, and more generally in my work and my work with New America, is how these two actually fit together. Because middle income or middle countries or smaller countries' ability to implement AI, and then the effects and the impact of that AI is constrained, in some cases perhaps enabled, by the broader geopolitical picture and the sort of broader issues around sovereignty and agency. So I'm going to structure the conversation today around these two strands. I'm going to start big and then kind of drill down from there into more granular. And I thought, Shashi, since we are in India, and not only because of that, but also because India is a very important player in this context, both...
And he's also the smartest person on this panel.
And you're also the smartest person on the panel. But also because I just want to emphasize that India also it's not just because we're in India. India is a very big player, both as a middle power. I think some people would even reject the label as a middle power. But also it is innovating so much on the ground in AI implementation. So I wanted to ask you if you could sort of talk to us a little bit about how you and how India is kind of thinking about these questions around AI sovereignty, AI agency, particularly in the context of these big sort of digital empires around the world.
Sure, thank you. Happy to be here. I think I'll first take up on the topic itself, the middle empire labeling. I'm sure the Prime Minister in his speech will strongly reject that. But more seriously, I think the question of sovereignty, I think, is very important to India. And I think there are two very different reasons why it is important. One is, of course, the geopolitical context, and we've seen that during COVID with vaccine availability. We've seen that with recent conflicts, be it the Russia-Ukraine war, where overnight a major big tech platform can take a policy decision and then shut off the voice from one of the parties to that conflict, right? So you definitely don't want a situation where India is dependent on foreign platforms to get its message out, or to do various things that we do in the digital economy. So sovereignty is clearly important, also from a supply chain standpoint, and we've seen that there are serious risks with the whole semiconductor supply chain. So sovereignty to us is not just about trying to beat the race between the US and China, but it is more about de-risking geopolitically, and it goes across the entire stack, all the way from the chips all the way to the platforms. But there's also another very important reason why I think sovereignty is very important for us, which is the cultural diversity and nuances. We've seen that especially with all the models that have been trained on data which is available publicly on the internet. be it ChatGPT, be it Gemini, and so on, it is very common that they lose out and miss out on the Indian cultural context, the nuances. India is not just 22 official languages. It is nearly 100 plus languages and dialects. All India Radio, which I was the CEO of a few years back, creates content in this entire diversity of Indian languages and dialects, and it goes beyond just written text. In fact, a lot of Indian dialects don't even have a digital footprint, right? So that is the kind of nuance that we don't want lost. So hence it becomes all the more important for India to build its own models. So that would be, I think, the broad context I would give.
Okay, I like that a lot. The sort of context and relevance as a form of sovereignty. Pablo, you've worked a lot on sovereignty, and we've talked about it. Can you maybe situate India's efforts within a sort of broader context of what other countries are doing and how they're approaching these questions?
Yeah, I'd love to. And first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. It's wonderful to be on this panel. It's wonderful to be here in New Delhi. By the way, can you guys hear me okay? Is this okay? So I think that everything that Shashi said is correct in that it really captures this idea, this growing idea of AI sovereignty. And Akash, you and I last talked in public about this, maybe kind of like mid-2025. And I think the question came up at that point, like, is sovereign AI or AI sovereignty, however it is that we can define it, and we can get into that, is it a real trend, right? And if so, how is it manifesting itself? I'll spend a couple of minutes giving you a preview of some work that I'm doing that will be released in the coming weeks by a think tank that I'm affiliated with called the Center for New American Security. Effectively, it's a sovereign AI index that over the last couple of years has been tracking every project that I've been able to find that is an infrastructure, a model building, or a data, AI data project funded by governments over the last couple of years. And I'll tell you that in 2024, those projects that I just articulated, there were 30 countries that were doing roughly 40 of these projects. By the end of 2025, so the beginning of 2026, that number had grown to roughly 130 projects across over 50 countries. And just to bring it back a little bit to India, India is absolutely in that index as a middle power. Now, I mean, you're a G20 country, and 17 of the 20 G20 countries are on this list. But one thing that I find very interesting about India, and perhaps this is something that we'd like to talk about, is that there are different countries are doing different things in terms of building up their sovereign AI capacity. India, as far as I can tell, is among basically 4 countries that are across the 3 parts of the stack that I'm tracking. Again, model building, infrastructure development, and data projects. India is right now one of 4 countries that is doing projects across each and every one of those. The others include South Korea, to a lesser scale, Taiwan, at a smaller scale, Sweden. And so this is absolutely a real trend. It is motivated by all the things that Shashi just mentioned. And so I think that's good to kind of ground it a little bit in some of the data that's out there in terms of how this trend is growing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll look forward to seeing that work. Natalie, I wanted to come to you. You've worked in international trade. And I was going to ask you to sort of situate this conversation within the shifting landscape of international trade. I think, from my point of view, it's moved me from being a skeptic on sovereignty to understanding, like, wow, maybe actually I see why countries would need it, right? Because it creates, there's a much bigger sense of vulnerability. On the other hand, I'm also wondering if it makes it harder to secure sovereignty given like chip export restrictions and things like that.
Well, firstly, it's just so exciting to be here. I've literally just landed in from London, arrived here in Delhi, and the energy is just incredible. And I'm really, really excited about the next couple of days, and what a great way to kick things off. So my background is a mixture of trade, and now I'm at the UK's communications regulator. And there's sort of 3 things I would say are on our minds when it comes to the debate about sovereignty. Because first of all, of course, there is no definition of actually what sovereignty means. I think it really depends where you sit at the table, what are the things that you're worried about. either from your own perspective or from what others might do to you. So at Ofcom, the communications regulator, some of the issues that we think about are, for example, innovation. So how is sovereignty going to drive access to innovation or potentially prevent it? So if certain companies are doing all their innovation in their home country and not in your country, what does that mean from a trade point of view? Or how do you retain R&D in your own country, or if there's the risk that it's going to go elsewhere? Number one. Number two is from the point of view of the user, be that individual consumers or businesses. What does sovereignty mean for those individuals? What do you want to make sure that they can access, they can't access? Of course, you quickly get into issues of privacy, etc., but I'm sure we'll sort of talk about this a bit more on the tactical side. And then thirdly, it's the issue of security. So I spend a lot of my time thinking about cybersecurity. Sovereignty in this context brings a whole nother level of complexity, which we probably haven't quite thought through yet in terms of how do some of the security implications of AI manifest themselves in your own economy when maybe you don't fully control the whole stack. And how realistic is it actually to control that stack? And I think that's probably the biggest question for sovereignty in terms of what does that mean for you where you sit, but also how far does it have to go? It's a spectrum. It's not an off or on switch. And so where particularly, again, I would probably, have some questions about the definition of middle powers. But depending where you sit in the world, you'll have a different view on where you want to sit on that spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I'm actually, the securities thing, I want to come back to the question of risk and sovereignty in a little bit. But first, I wanted to move to Kate. Thank you for being here. And, Kate and I met at the DPI Summit in Cape Town a while ago. And we had a really great conversation. And I think we were thinking about sovereignty and AI stack in a very different way there, right? Kate does really fascinating work with what I think of as frugal infrastructure, light infrastructure. And so maybe you can talk about that. You can talk about your work a little bit and also talk about how that's a kind of, how countries are approaching sovereignty or how you're thinking about sovereignty through that perspective.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here. So when it comes to sovereignty, in my company, we're seeing more as providing governments and institutions across the global south to have choice over their infrastructure, but also control over their own infrastructure. What does that mean? Not every country has the power to build gigawatts infrastructure, invest hundreds of billions of dollars. We mentioned it, Shashi mentioned it already. A lot of the large language models today are trained on data coming from the internet, but you still have 2.2 billion people that are unconnected. That means a lot of their data is actually not represented. Their culture, their languages, their knowledge systems are not represented and integrated in the large language models that are the most widely used today. So when we thought about sovereignty, we actually looked at how could we support governments to understand what it truly takes to really have infrastructure that resemble your local context, that integrate your local context, but also support reaching the people in your country. That means being in control and having the choice over which infrastructure you invest in, whether it's buying GPUs from the US or buying GPUs from China or looking at alternative chips. Be it also understanding what is the minimum viable compute infrastructure that you need to equip yourself. There's parts of data that needs to stay sovereign. There's part of data that needs to stay resident in your country. Really understanding how much infrastructure you need to build to support that equals sovereignty for a lot of the countries we're working with. And then you go up the stack looking at the models, a lot of advancement in open source today, but also looking at some of the research that goes into under-resourced languages. Africa has 2,500 languages, and a lot of them are still not written today, right? A lot of them are spoken. So how do we go about reaching populations and amplifying and diversifying the amount of data and the quality and the diversity of data that goes into training those models for countries? So we now deploy that stack across countries in Africa, in the Caribbean, in Latin America, and also expanding into Southeast Asia. And truly, the goal is providing countries a way to generate value locally rather than exporting it, but also supporting that economic transition into a digital economy.
Yeah, thanks. I guess the question that I don't really fully grasp about sovereignty and that comes up here is I mean, to me, the AI stack is, as we know, AI is not a single thing. And so it's fundamentally interconnected, layered. And the problem I have with sovereignty is it just seems like not a very feasible goal, unless you're like literally controlling. I'm going to ask, this question's for you actually, right? So I'm just trying to understand, like, are we talking about degrees of sovereignty? Is that the issue here? Or are we talking about finding points of vulnerability? Because we're clearly not talking about like a totally cut off sort of autarky, like independent sovereign stack for any country, right?
No, I agree. I don't think we are talking of complete islands, which, but yes, it is about degrees of sovereignty, clearly. Let me give a couple of examples that will probably set this context, right? In India, you have a population with one of the highest penetration of mobile devices, right? Nearly 1 billion mobile phones. And one of the highest data consumption. On an average, the Indian mobile user consumes anywhere close to 20 to 30 GB of data every month, and it's all video, right? So the kind of consumption that's happening in India is very different from the kind of consumption of content that happens in the rest of the world. Similarly, when it comes to the kinds of use cases, for example, in India you have UPI for digital payments. Now there's a large part of the population, which I would very strongly relate to what Kate was saying, who are comfortable with the spoken interface. They are not comfortable with the UI interface, the way it's designed with a very different user persona in mind, right? So for those kinds of use cases, for those kinds of users, you have very different needs and different workloads. So the chips are perhaps need to be optimized differently. The sovereign AI infrastructure on the cloud needs to be optimized differently. So I think those are the kinds of motivations why you would want to think differently on sovereign.
Right. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, but I think that your point is well taken, and it's something that we really do need to keep in mind. I mean, sovereign AI is a headline, but it doesn't really. I mean, it doesn't capture the reality of many so-called sovereign AI deployments. Again, kind of pointing back to the research that I've been doing. The vast majority of public sector-led sovereign AI projects that I've been tracking include partnerships with foreign technology companies, and so I think that's just simply a reality of a country building a stack that it has more control over. But what you do see though is countries, rather than kind of treating, to your point, rather than treating sovereignty as a monolith, they look at they think of sovereignty. Think about it this way: it's not necessarily a goal; it's more like a strategy for how you minimize risk in the parts of the stack that you as a country really care about. For example, if you care about data, then you organize your data in a strategic way. If you care about models, then you're going to deploy those in a particular way. But the reality on the ground today, and probably for the foreseeable future, is that sovereign AI will involve partnerships with third parties outside of the country, and it's just going to be a matter of managing those relationships.
Right. So, I mean, moving on a little bit into the nitty-gritty of implementation, and this is for you, Kate. Talk about how the tools you're developing fit in within the broader ecosystem, right? And how you mentioned, there are open source models, and your models can be plugged into those or built on those. How do you fit in with like the big players who might be seen as perhaps threatening or impinging on a country's sovereignty?
Yeah, so we're looking at it from a more frugal and smaller approach. So when I spoke about the minimum viable compute infrastructure, this is exactly what we're doing. We're looking into how can we deploy micro data centers that can be powered by renewable, that support countries hosting just the critical type of data that they have or they consider critical and sovereign to themselves. Then we do a lot of work around the data transformation. So most of our countries today still rely on very analog, fragmented, scattered data ecosystem, and a lot of our countries are still run on paper format. So how do you go about transforming that data, digitizing that data, structuring that data so that you have contextualized data pipeline that then can be used to train or fine-tune local models? From a model standpoint, a lot of countries want to have choices. So they want to have choices to potentially be able to use global models that are fine-tuned to their context using their data locally, or they want to be able to support local ecosystem of startups, developers, to train their own model locally as well. So we also look at those two approaches. On one side, supporting local ecosystem of startups to build smaller model. You would look, rather than building models that are billions of parameters, you would look at more specialized, highly contextualized models that are deployed for very specific applications, be it in education or in agriculture, in climate resilience and such. And that for countries actually provide an agency and choice over really what they want to have or define sovereignty, which is generating value locally and making sure that their developers and their ecosystem is empowered in this AI economy. You know, when we think about infrastructure, and I'm going to piggyback a little bit on what Pablo was saying, we look at it in the global south. Within the next decade, we will add 1.2 billion people to who will enter a working age. But if we don't have infrastructure, or if we don't build infrastructure today to support those 1.2 billion people in an AI age, how are we going to support them and empowering our economies? And a lot of countries in our regions today are waking up to this idea, because for centuries, whether it's our natural resources, they've all been exported out of the countries and then shipped back to us and sold at a premium. And we're about to enter a similar digital colonialism, I will call it, as we're getting into AI, because the truth is most of the compute infrastructure sits outside of our countries today. Africa has less than 1% of the world's compute capacity for 18% of the population. So there is a balance that needs to really be achieved, and we can only do that if we look at AI sovereignty and AI infrastructure in a different way than what the global north has been trying to push us to.
Yeah, thanks for that. Kate, I wanted to ask you, Natalie, sorry, Kate mentioned something about choice, and it seems to me like one of the sort of often implicit ideas here is creating a more pluralistic, diverse AI ecosystem as a way of maintaining countries' choices. So I wanted to ask you, because I know you do some work with Ofcom, where presumably you're looking at competition law and things like that. And you know, that's certainly one view, that you can promote sovereignty through competition and diversity. On the other hand, like I would say, that has so often not worked out for countries, because what it leads to is consolidation, and we know that the large companies can come in and monetize data and do loss leading and things like that. So I'm wondering if you're looking at this from a kind of regulatory lens and you're trying to sort of promote sovereignty, is it choice and plurality, or should countries be throwing their weight behind kind of national champions, the way like the Asian tigers built themselves up back in the 80s or whenever that was?
Thanks, Kash. I mean, this is such a good question, and I don't at all pretend to have the answers, because actually this gets to the fundamentals of how do you protect consumers and businesses in the marketplace today. The traditional economic models that we've used, like competition, exactly as you say, arguably won't work in the era of AI sovereignty, because you've got oligopolies, arguably monopolies in certain areas. So you can't promote competition in the way that you might have done traditionally using competition law. Some of the mechanisms that we've tried in the past, for example, sharing of infrastructure, we've done that in the UK through the sharing of telecoms infrastructure to help drive competition in the marketplace. Is that realistic in the AI stack? Could you imagine a world where certain companies would be up for sharing some of their infrastructure? That's a question. So I actually think that in terms of where we go next, of protecting consumers and businesses, this is going to be the big economic debate in terms of what models actually work for regulation. But there has to be a big injection of reality. I think that's sort of the theme that's coming across from everything that everyone said. We have to work with the world as it is, not how we hope it will be. And the way that the stack is structured at the moment, and I'm afraid that will probably be more consolidation, not less, it means there are going to be very few intervention points for government. So they're going to have to be very, very smart about where they choose and when to try and drive specific outcomes.
How much time do we have left before questions? Like 5 or 6 minutes? Yeah, okay. I wanted to drill down just a little bit on the question of open source, because it seems like such an important question in this. And I guess I'd throw the question open, well, maybe Shashi or Kate, whoever wants to take it, on the role that open source plays in both in the question of sovereignty, but also in enabling or possibly inhibiting meaningful and impactful implementations in middle countries.
I'll bring it back to the first theme around geopolitics, because from where I'm sitting, we see our countries battling with two sides. On one side, they're being pushed a lot of technology that's coming, closed source technology that's coming from the US. And on the other side, actually in Africa, the most widely used models today are actually the Chinese open source models. So the Quen, the Kimis, the DeepSeeks of the world. So it actually shows that today you can't actually decouple AI from geopolitics or technology from geopolitics, and open source is playing a large role into enabling communities who historically have been marginalized and haven't had access to a lot of the computing power to be able to train those large language models, to be able to now basically build for themselves. So a lot of the developers we're working with are actually adopting those open source tools because one is what they have access to, and secondly, right now, they're some of the most performant tools that they can get access in the ecosystem. So even us as a company, we made the conscious choice that every foundation models that we're training, we're building, we're actually releasing them open source because we know that one of the power of our region is the smart developers that have already been practicing AI and machine learning for decades, and they just need access and they just need empowerment around that technology. So, in my opinion, across the global south, open source will win.
Just to build. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, no, please.
Yeah, so I'll just add one more point. I mean, open source is important, but I think what is also more important is compute at the edge. And I think that is probably where you'll see a lot of innovation coming out of India, where we will try to optimize AI models for edge devices. And what also becomes very important once you have an edge computing scenario, be it laptops, be it mobile phones and so on, is that you have a secure and safe way of ensuring that the right models are being pushed. And that's where I see another innovation that's happening in India called direct-to-mobile broadcasting, or D2M, where potentially you could push out AI models and data sets to these edge devices in a very secure and reliable fashion. So that way, you know that there's no malicious models going around and so on.
Just two last things on this, just building on the other speakers' points. There are kind of two sides to the open model issue. On the input side, roughly 40% of the model projects that I've been tracking are built, they're essentially fine-tuning of models like Llama and other open source models. Interestingly, by the way, the more recent ones are really more Quen and other Chinese models, so Llama seems to be kind of like falling in terms of popularity. So that's on the input side. On the output side, roughly 70% of the model projects that I've been tracking are open source, which is fascinating, right? Because these are projects that have the moniker of sovereignty, and yet they are open. They are released to the world. And to Natalie's point about what markets look like, I think that might be a predictor of what's going to happen over time, that more and more of these open models get out there, assuming that they have capacity, to compete with proprietary and more, and larger models, then perhaps that levels the playing field a little bit, or gives more choice in different regions. So that's what I'm seeing in the data.
Yeah, one last thing I wanted to come to, and then I'm gonna go open it up. We talked about risk a little bit before, and I was actually reading Dario Amode's essay on risk on the flight over. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to look at it, but so I think in this question of sort of like use case and implementation, there's a weird thing that's happened with risk in the AI debate, which is that it started off being the only thing that everybody talked about in that kind of like hyped up Silicon Valley existential risk. And then there was like a reaction to it, and then like now we sort of scoff at people that talk about risk. And so I was thinking as I was reading this essay about risk and about our conversation today. And I guess I'm thinking, there's a whole gamut of risk that runs from kind of existential risk to the cyber sort of risk that you're talking about, to just like social and economic disruption risk. And the question is sort of, are we, in focusing a lot on use cases and implementation now, are we in danger of overlooking risk? And how should we be thinking about risk within this framework?
So I think it's a really good question. at the moment, and you're right, the sort of swings and roundabouts, right, in terms of how much attention people play. And of course, the original AI summit was very much focused on safety and security. I think the challenge is that a lot of focus and attention can go on the extreme end, the thing that gets everyone really, really excited. And actually, when you're thinking about AI adoption, the thing that we all want to do is make sure that our businesses and consumers are making the most out of AI because we see the economic advantage. But the challenge is, from an individual point of view, it's still pretty scary, right? You're putting all your data out there. You probably don't quite understand what's happening. In the UK, around 28% of the population say that they're sort of comfortable with using AI, which I think is actually surprisingly high. But of course, that means over 70% aren't. And so I think there's a lot of value to focusing on actually what risk feels like from an individual consumer and user point of view, as well as the systemic and, of course, the global risk that sometimes we jump to because that seems a bit more exciting to discuss.
Anybody want to say anything about risk before we open it up?
Just add one perspective, like in India, I think the bigger concern is not so much about the risk of existential issues, but more about the divide. Right, because you have the elite urban segment of the population, which is very savvy with technology, has the judgment to know what to trust AI with and what not to. But then you have a very large part of the population which does not have access, and their understanding of these tools is very limited, very shallow, very superficial. So that divide, to me, is the bigger risk from an India standpoint.
So kind of societal risk, yeah. So. Okay, thank you all for that. And it's a pretty crowded room. Thank you all for turning out. And I think we can open it up to some questions. Gordon, do you want me to flag people down? Okay. So yeah, you want to go?
Yeah.
So I just want to ask, because there's a lot of people here in limited time, keep them questions rather than commentary, and as pointed as possible, or as short as possible. Not necessarily pointed. They don't have to be pointed.
Please not
They don't have to
pointed.
be pointed or sharp.
If
As
you're
short
pointing
and
at
focused as possible.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way. Yeah, right.
All right. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. So I wanted to open to anyone on the panel. I'm just reading off my phone here. How does the goal of AI sovereignty deal with the fact that optimal discretionary consumers, both at the institutional and everyday person level, will choose the best system for them, which as it stands exists dominantly in Western economies? We know how fast implementation arrives in AI, and so I wonder if today's AI companies will build these deep data moats with regional economies, which makes it much harder for them to kind of build their own AI models or infrastructure later on, and then more importantly, have consumers that are already integrated and familiar with these current Western dominating models swap off for a domestic competitor. Like how do we think about that as it stands right now?
Anybody want to take that?
It's a packed question. So I'll try to pick on bits and pieces, and I don't have a crystal ball, so I can't tell you what's going to happen in the future. But I can tell you what I'm seeing today. And what I'm seeing today, the truth is a lot of our governments are still doing deals with Western models because these right now are the most performant, some of the most performant on the market, or they don't have the capacity to fine-tune and train their own. So that's the reality of today. But at the same time, they're waking up to the idea and becoming conscious of that potential digital colonialism cycle that might repeat itself. WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook are some of the most widely used applications in our economy, yet the economic value of those applications is generated somewhere else. And when we're talking to government, the first thing they're telling us is, we know that AI is supposed to add billion to the economy, but how do we do so? So they're now starting to rethink the way they're seeing those global technology partnerships, and also looking into how can they demand for those global models to, one, invest in the local country or economy, but then secondly, potentially choose local or regional rather than global. So we're seeing that shift already happen, and this is a shift in the mentality of our governments that is also driving the way the implementation and the diffusion of the models is happening on the ground locally.
Okay. Yeah, the lady there.
First of all, thank you for the panel discussion. So I'm Anushka from IMT Ghaziabad. I'm doing my MBA. My question is basically that given the disparities in the middle power countries and the smaller countries, will this, and especially Pablo made a point about the third parties partners that will be there. So how we will govern the sovereignty of these countries? How will the negotiations take place? Will there be a global South bloc which will talk to the Western counterparts, or will there be, because smaller countries, if they go for negotiating tables, they would not get the best of the deal.
So kind of collaborative type approach to AI, an
Yeah.
alliance type approach
Yeah.
to sovereignty. Anybody?
Yeah, no, it's a really thought-provoking question. I'm like trying to find pen and paper to like figure out like if I can write this as a paper, in the next week or so. Look, I'll tell you that there are definitely examples of blocks of countries coming together to start developing, right? So for sure, BRICS is an example, and there seems to be a fair amount of cooperation there. There are other examples of, like, for example, like the South Koreans and the Indonesians are cooperating on a Southeast Asian AI project. But I think that, like, fundamentally, the thing that I have really kind of been watching recently, and Kate kind of keeps bringing this up, which is that, look, most of the sovereign AI development is happening in Europe, Middle East, Asia, and again, I'll mention that India is a major source of sovereign AI projects. Africa is way behind. There is basically, there's very little happening there. A little bit more in the Americas, throughout Latin America. But I think that as we think about these kind of collections of countries, perhaps there might be an opportunity in places like Africa to do that, where there is clear. The data shows that there is a need there.
The lady behind that? You? Yeah.
Very good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for this insightful discussion. Being a corporate lawyer, I am very much into competition law. So when you said that sovereignty can be achieved with the competition law, my very simple question is, like, we all know that AI models work independently and at the same pace with all the countries. So as far as AI is concerned, so with respect to competition law, can we have a harmony or a common or a universal law applicable to all the countries, despite we waste our time in inculcating and accommodating in each law? Because as far as I know, India is only 2 decades old with respect to competition law. It passed in 2003. So can we have an harmonization at least in this concern?
Thank you. Firstly, I'd just clarify that unfortunately I don't think we're in the place where competition law can solve all of these problems. But you raise a really interesting question. What is the mechanism we can use to achieve the outcomes that we think we need in this space? Mm-hmm. And for Ofcom, the UK's communications regulator, our approach actually has been to be technologically neutral. So we do not regulate AI. We regulate for the outcomes that AI might be driving. So fairness, transparency, et cetera. And personally, I think that's where we will have to go more and more, because the technology is moving so fast. There's no way that the legislative process can keep up. And obviously there are examples in Europe where we've had similar challenges. Your second part of the question around sort of global harmonization, the track record for any of this is not great. And again, I think a bureaucratic response quite often misunderstands how this technology is revolutionizing day-to-day interactions, let alone global interactions. So at least from our point of view, increasingly our emphasis is on outcomes, because the outcomes we want for society are still pretty much the same. Back to the excellent point Shashi was making in terms of we want a more equal society. We don't want a less equal society. So how can you approach regulation of the outcomes in that way, taking account of technology, but not being too prescriptive?
I want to just ask a clarifying question there, because one of the things that comes up a lot in sort of discussion of regulation and competition over technology is the difference between ex ante and ex post regulation, and that ex ante regulation is quite dangerous and can stifle innovation. So when you talk about outcome-based regulation, do you see that as post regulation, or do you see it as, how do you see that?
So as much as possible, we are trying to flex and adapt because I don't think you can be too prescriptive.
Right.
And sort of back to the earlier point about none of us have a crystal ball. So instead, what we're trying to do is create, for example, sandboxes. So you might have individual innovation licenses to tackle specific problems, because then you don't have to either define ex ante or ex post too prescriptively. But more often than not, I think actually the biggest challenge for a regulator is not where you sit on the legal spectrum, but actually trying to identify the problems you're trying to solve. And you need industry to come to you and say, we would like to do this, but we're not quite sure how you're going to feel about it. How can we have a conversation which is not going to feel like a legal conversation, but one where we can work together on the outcomes that we want to achieve? And that kind of trusted conversation is where I think regulators need to be more and more.
Thanks.
Working on like AI policy, and one of the things that we're looking into is the possibility for middle powers to collaborate on building sort of shared compute infrastructure. What are your thoughts generally as a panel on the idea and its viability, especially, you know, maybe picking up on earlier comments that you made about the relationship with hyperscalers? Can a regional bloc have better bargaining power, perhaps?
So there are examples of this, right? So the European Union right now is building compute capacity throughout the continent. India is another example of kind of common compute, right? Where essentially kind of like they're bringing together resources to to deploy in a strategic way, kind of depending on nonprofits or research institutions or startups. And I guess that I would say that there are plenty of models that exist right now. Canada is another example. They're doing this. These have started. I think the question is, have we seen enough to know whether there's going to be success? And I just don't. I mean, we're just getting started. So we should have this conversation maybe a year from now or 18 months from now, because right now I think it's too soon to tell.
I also want to just say, we have somebody in the back here, Josh Tan, who's doing a lot of really interesting work in this regard in Europe in particular. So you could talk to him. And I also, like, within this paradigm, there's different models emerging. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but India's model of not necessarily building the dedicated compute, but buying compute and fractional time is a very interesting one.
So I think what the India AI mission has done is they've empaneled the hyperscalers with certain compute capacity at a certain price point, and then they've selected startups and researchers who applied for this compute capacity, and they've been giving it to them. So that's one model. Since collaboration came up in two questions, I wanted to give one more example of collaboration, which is of a slightly different kind in the area of edge intelligence and direct to mobile D2M, where you have a standard which was built in the US, ATSC3. You have a chip which was designed in India by Sankhya Labs. And you have one of the biggest markets in Latin America, in Brazil now, adopting the standard. So there's a different kind of collaboration that's happening around edge AI, which will, I think, something again we can look at 6 months down the road.
That's great. Yeah. Back to the blue shirt.
Hi.
Yeah, I think you said blue shirt.
Right. All right. Thank you for the wonderful discussion. So my question is that in the pursuit of the third way, how do we distinguish between the strategic partnership versus structural dependency, especially given the fact that most of the frontier models that are coming up are owned by foreign entities which are private ones?
Yeah. So Microsoft and OpenAI probably feel the same way, right? How do you who wants to take that? Strategy partnership versus a dependency relationship.
That is a tough question. Again, it depends on, I guess, the outcomes you're trying to create for your country, right? The truth is today, most of our countries don't have the choice but to rely on structural dependencies. So I was talking about the statistics about the compute in Africa, less than 1%, which means all our data is processed on the cloud somewhere else in US, China, or in Europe. So that's the reality today. But then how do we move into a place where we lessen, or I think it's about the question of risk and resilience, right? We build more resilience locally. We try to edge against the global risks, especially around geopolitics, because if tomorrow more regulations comes in, like the US Cloud Act that says that basically any US cloud software that you're using as part of your stack can be opened by any US intelligence agency or the US government. If there is tomorrow more restrictions around, more export control restrictions in certain countries, all countries will be the one who will pay the price. So the question is, how do we lessen our dependency on those structural realities, but also how do we start building locally? And I think going back to the collaboration approach, we're actually seeing this happening in Africa as well, because a lot of our countries don't even have the necessary energy to power a lot of that infrastructure. So you have ECOWAS, for example, which is the West African region composed of Nigeria, Togo, Benin, a couple of other countries like Cote d'Ivoire, who are now trying to pull resources to build regional infrastructure. So you would have hub and spoke, where you would have a larger infrastructure that could be in a country that has abundance of energy, which will be funded by everybody else. But then you also have smaller compute in country that can guarantee the sovereignty and the residency of the data. So we're seeing those models kind of now emerging, and it will take a couple of years for them to materialize, but these are steps that are being taken to lessen our dependency on larger scale infrastructure.
Yeah.
Thank you. I know I'm running out of time. This question is specifically for Kate. You contrasted technology in Africa being pushed by the global north, but in contrast, Chinese models enjoying popularity. Could you speak more on what aspects of China's LLMs or AI stack the global south finds very attractive? Thank you.
I'll be very brief. There are two aspects, and these are very simple. The first one is that they're open source and not closed source. So what's less known is that Africa has a large population of developers that are very savvy. If you look at years back, the tiny machine learning movement that look at edge computing and moving intelligence closer to where the data is collected, Kenya was actually the third largest chapter in the world after US and Europe. So you had a lot of developers who could only get access to like ARM-based compute platform who started building edge models basically running on smaller compute infrastructure. So open source is key because open source provide access. So developers want to be able to cook their own food per se. And then the second one is performance. If you look at performance benchmarks today, a lot of the top models are actually Chinese models, including Qwen. So when developers look at access and performance, the choice is quickly made. That's why they've been choosing Chinese models today.
Yeah, I mean, when Llama or when Meta stopped kind of focusing on this, that really gave Chinese models an opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the gentleman in the back, yep.
Thank you. My name is Arjun Sendal, and I'm a student at the Indian School of Public Policy. So I've come across the word sovereignty in two contexts. That is the national context, which attracts the bulk of the attention in popular discourse. And then there's the individual context, individual sovereignty. And I think this is something that Natalie touched on a little bit, where I, as the individual end user, have the agency and the tools to decide how exposed I am to these different AI platforms models, whether they are foreign or domestic. So shouldn't this be our ultimate objective? Wouldn't, by addressing individual sovereignty, wouldn't we ultimately address national sovereignty? I mean, if I can control how exposed I am to these models as an individual user, wouldn't my country be secured as well?
Yeah, you want to take that? That's a great question. The individual agency.
Yeah, it's such a good question. From the point of view of the individual, I think one of the most interesting debates at the moment is obviously AI agents and the extent to which individuals will be informed enough to understand how their own decision making is being influenced in time by the agents, and to what extent you might see some discrimination of individuals through the fact that they have devoid a lot of agency to their AI agents. The challenge is, and this has been the history of foreign policy forever, cumulative work on individuals' points of views doesn't necessarily work at a maximus level in terms of what's in the best interest for a country. And I think that's probably something we haven't even started to think about. I'm sure it will come out over the next couple of days, but it's not necessarily a given that what's right for an individual is right for the country, or vice versa. And that's where the debate will need to go.
Yes.
Thank you. A lot of value actually gets created by the business applications. We are really looking at the large, like Kate, you reflected on that. And for business applications, you really have to build local models using local data, local problems, local modalities like you talked about. So would that make the entire case for sovereignty irrelevant if you actually start building business applications rather than focusing on the existing popular B2C models?
So yeah, thanks for bringing the focus back to, this is the implementation question to some extent. Anybody want to take that?
I can add a very brief comment that there are large number of public use cases and defense, right? So those are not the same as your business use cases. So you will still need sovereignty. I don't think solving for business will solve for national security or for any of the public services.
Healthcare, for example, healthcare is a very localized, local issues, local diseases, and local persona, local genomics.
You want? No, I mean, I would just say that healthcare actually seems like one of those areas where, because of the sensitivity of the data, sovereignty actually becomes a big issue. But I take your point that maybe more focus top of the stack would be a good, interesting way to go in this conversation. So I think we can do a couple more questions.
There's a lady there.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I can't
We are
see you.
generally pointing to a lady in the back.
I can't see you from my seat. But
If you're a lady in the back, please.
Thank you so much. I am from Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. So this question is coming a little bit from that defense military background of mine. A significant problem that we face in terms of discussion regarding global regulation is the question of haves and have-nots that often comes with it. That once you have regulation, there's a certain amount of exclusionary behavior that happens, especially with the global south. So my question, because regulation and the approach to regulation was discussed here, my question is, how do you see specifically in the current geopolitical environment and given the history of regulations that we have seen so far, how do you see AI regulation is supposed to shape up given the discussion we are having? Thank you.
Okay, I'm told that despite that clock in the back, our time's actually up, so we have to answer this really quickly.
Yes.
You can do a little better than that. Okay, I'm sorry. Apparently we're out of time because the next session has to come in, right? Okay. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you to the panelists, all your respective time zones.